My name is Celine Bird, and at 32 years old, I'm a captain in the United States Army. I used to think that service, discipline, and honor were the highest values a person could have. But at my father-in-law's 65th birthday party, he told me otherwise. You are a piece of useless trash, a grunt soldier, and my son deserves better than you, Vincent declared, his voice cracking across the dining room like a whip. 23 members of the family turned to look at me in stunned silence. The chandelier overhead cast harsh bulbs on Vincent's weathered face, making his contempt look even sharper. He turned to the wife of a business partner sitting next to me and said, "Now that's a real wife." They didn't know that this grunt soldier was the anonymous investor who had saved his empire from bankruptcy. They had no idea what was coming. Before I tell you how the text message I sent brought that entire dynasty to its knees, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you believe that honor can't be bought with money. The air in the private dining room of the Heathman Hotel in downtown Portland was thick with the scent of old money and new anxieties. Rich, dark oak panels lined the walls, absorbing the warm glow of the candlelight and the low hum of forced conversation. My father-in-law, Vincent Morrison, had booked the entire room. He stood at the head of the long mahogany table, a crystal glass of Willamette Valley Pinot Noir held aloft, his voice booming with the unearned confidence of a man who had never been told no. He was in the middle of a toast, a self-congratulatory monologue about landing the new Crown Plaza contract. "And we couldn't have done it," he proclaimed, his eyes sweeping across the room, "without the faith of our silent investor, a true visionary." I sat there, feeling the weight of 23 pairs of eyes, not on Vincent, but on me. I could feel the familiar, probing stares of Isaac's aunts, their whispers always hovering just at the edge of my hearing, words like, unladylike, too intense, not what we expected for our Isaac. Under the crisp white tablecloth, my husband Isaac squeezed my hand. It wasn't a gesture of love, not really. It was a weak, sweaty gesture of fear. He was as terrified of his father as everyone else in this room. The entire atmosphere was a venomous mix of opulence and dread, and as usual, I was the unwilling target at the center of it all. Vincent finished his toast, and a wave of polite applause rippled through the room. As he sat down, his smile, which had been plastered across his face, slowly dissolved as his gaze landed on me. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The performative warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, undisguised disdain. He cleared his throat. The room, which had just started to buzz again with conversation, fell quiet once more. He didn't just speak the words, he pronounced them like a judge handing down a death sentence to my honor. "You are a piece of useless trash," he said, his voice low but carrying with lethal precision. "A grunt soldier, and my son deserves better than you." Silence. Absolute, crushing silence. The clinking of silverware stopped. The gentle murmur of conversation died instantly. I could hear the soft, sharp gasp of the woman sitting next to me. Time itself seemed to slow down. I did what any soldier does when under fire. I scanned my surroundings for an ally, for a friendly face. My eyes darted around the table, from my brother-in-law to my sister-in-law, to the cousins, to the aunts. Nothing. I found only eyes staring intently down at their plates of pan-seared salmon, as if the secrets of the universe were hidden in a sprig of dill. I saw averted gazes, faces suddenly fascinated by the patterns on the wallpaper. Not a single person would meet my eyes, not one. Their silence was an indictment. It was louder, more damning, and infinitely more cruel than his words. It was consent. But Vincent wasn't finished. He raised a thick, manicured finger and pointed it toward Mrs. Henderson, the wife of his business partner. She was a frail-looking woman, draped in a pearl necklace that probably cost more than my first car. "Now that's a real wife," he announced, his voice now filled with a syrupy, false admiration. "A woman who knows her place, who supports her husband from behind the scenes." The insult was surgical in its precision. It was an attack on everything I was, my independence, my career in the army, my years of service. It was a dismissal of every medal I'd ever earned, every sacrifice I'd ever made. And then came the final, quiet betrayal. I glanced at my mother-in-law, Patricia. She, more than anyone, knew about the Kestrel Trust I inherited, even if she didn't know its true scale. She simply gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head, her eyes pleading with me, as if to say, "Just let it go. Don't challenge him." Her cowardice was permission. In their world, I wasn't just an outsider, I was a fundamental failure as a woman. A sharp physical pain bloomed in my chest. For a moment, it felt hard to breathe. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a strange, crystalline coldness that spread through my veins. It was a feeling I knew well. It was discipline. It was the training from West Point kicking in, overriding the messy, chaotic surge of human emotion. The pain was still there, but it was now compartmentalized, filed away. My movements became deliberate, precise. I placed my heavy silver fork down next to my plate. The small clink was the only sound in the suffocating silence. I raised my head and looked directly into Vincent's eyes. There were no tears in mine. There was nothing. Just the vast, empty calm of a battlefield after the fight is over. "Thank you for dinner," I said. My voice was even, level, devoid of any inflection. It was the voice I used to give a briefing, not the voice of a woman whose soul had just been publicly flayed. I pushed my chair back and stood up. With a stiff, formal nod that I'd given 1,000 times in military ceremonies, I acknowledged the entire table. "Celine, don't," Isaac whispered, a pathetic plea from across the table. But his voice was a distant echo. I had already turned. I walked toward the heavy oak doors, my back straight, my steps measured. I wasn't running, I wasn't fleeing, I was executing a tactical retreat. The objective, maintaining my dignity in a hostile environment, had been compromised. The new objective was to regroup and plan a counteroffensive. The heavy door swung shut behind me with a solid, definitive thud, sealing me off from that room of cowards. The muffled silence of the hotel corridor enveloped me. I took one deep breath, then another. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. The screen lit up my face in the dim light. The real war, it turned out, was just beginning. I don't remember the drive away from the Heathman. My mind was a blur of shock and adrenaline. But I found myself driving through the familiar streets of Portland, the wipers on my car sweeping away the persistent, misty drizzle that felt so unique to the city. The rhythmic slap of the blades against the glass was hypnotic, and as I drove, the raw wound of tonight's humiliation began to ache with the phantom pains of older scars. That's the thing about deep wounds. They never truly heal. They just wait for a fresh injury to tear them open again. And tonight, Vincent hadn't just created a new wound. He had ripped open every old one I had. My mind drifted back 8 years to a warm summer day that felt a lifetime away. It was my graduation from West Point. The memory should have been a triumphant one, but it was tainted by the bitter taste of injustice. Isaac's grandfather, a decorated officer from the old school, was a man I deeply respected. Before he passed, he had left his West Point class ring, a heavy gold piece of history with a simple instruction. The ring was to go to the first of his grandchildren to follow in his footsteps and graduate from a military academy. I was the only one. The entire Morrison clan had come to the ceremony on the plains of West Point. They sat in the stands, fanning themselves in the humid New York heat, looking entirely out of place amongst the families of soldiers. I remember searching for them in the crowd as I stood in my dress grays, feeling a surge of pride and a small hollow hope that today, maybe today, they would finally see me. See what I had accomplished. That hope died later that evening at a stuffy restaurant on the Hudson. Vincent, playing the role of family patriarch, tapped his glass for attention. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it. Inside, resting on faded satin, was the ring. My heart pounded in my chest. This was it. This was the moment of acceptance. But Vincent didn't look at me. He looked past me, to Isaac's older brother, David, a mid-level investment banker with soft hands and a cynical smile. Vincent stood up, walked over to David, and presented the ring to him. "A soldier's legacy," Vincent announced to the table, his voice thick with patriarchal authority, "belongs to a man." I just sat there, frozen. The air was sucked out of my lungs. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me, a mix of pity and discomfort. Isaac, to his credit, started to speak up. "Dad, that's not right. Celine is the one who—" But it took only one sharp, cold glare from Vincent to silence him. Isaac's protest died in his throat, and he slumped back in his chair, defeated. And in that moment, I understood. I would always be an outsider, my achievements rendered invisible by my gender. And that wasn't the only time. It was a pattern, a quiet but consistent erosion of my worth. Years later, when I was serving in Iraq, my unit was ambushed. I was awarded the Bronze Star Medal for valor after pulling 2 of my wounded soldiers out of the line of fire. It was the proudest and most terrifying day of my life. I sent a photo of myself with the medal pinned to my uniform back home to the family. I thought maybe this, a recognition of courage under fire, was something they could understand, something they couldn't ignore. The reply from Patricia, my mother-in-law, came a day later. It was a single text message. "Be safe." That was it. No pride, no congratulations, no acknowledgement of the sacrifice it represented, just a casual, dismissive platitude. To them, my career wasn't a source of honor. It was a bizarre and dangerous hobby. It was something to be tolerated, an embarrassment that interfered with my real duties as a Morrison wife. They measured success in bank account zeros, in the square footage of a mansion in the West Hills. They couldn't understand the value of honor, because honor is something you earn, not something you inherit. It can't be bought, and it can't be sold. That deep-seated ignorance was why, a year ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life. My financial manager, Mr. Davies, a close friend of my late father, had called me with some intelligence. Morrison Development was on the verge of bankruptcy. Vincent's ego and reckless investments had driven the company into the ground. My first instinct was to let it happen. Let him crash and burn. It would be a fitting end for his arrogance. But then Davies sent me the portfolio for their flagship project, the very same Crown Plaza contract Vincent was bragging about tonight. Buried deep in the fine print was a provision, a small section dedicated to building a block of subsidized housing for homeless veterans. My conscience kicked in. My duty as an officer, my loyalty to my brothers and sisters in arms, wouldn't let me stand by and watch that opportunity be lost. I couldn't let them down, even if it meant saving a man I despised. So, I gave Mr. Davies the order. "Invest," I told him. "Give him exactly what he needs. But on one condition, absolute anonymity." I lied to myself. I told myself I was doing it for the veterans. But a part of me, a small foolish part, hoped that this act of silent salvation would be the ultimate proof of my worth. That one day, the truth would come out, and he would finally have to acknowledge that the grunt soldier he so openly disdained had been his savior all along. I was wrong. I pulled my car over into a turnout overlooking the Willamette River. The lights of the Hawthorne Bridge glittered against the dark water, a string of cold, distant diamonds. The pain from the ring, the sting of the ignored medal, and the raw public humiliation of tonight, it all coalesced inside me. It sharpened from a dull, throbbing ache into a cold diamond of resolve. They had spent years chipping away at me, trying to make me feel small, invisible. They had tried to take my honor. Now, I was going to take the only thing they had ever valued: their money, their status, their entire hollow empire. I picked up my phone, my fingers steady. I scrolled through my contacts and pressed the call button for Mr. Davies. He answered on the first ring. My voice, when it came out, was devoid of all emotion. It was the voice of a commander giving an order. "Mr. Davies," I said. "Celine." His voice was warm with concern, but I cut him off. "Operation Desert Storm is a go. Target, Morrison Development. Rules of engagement. No prisoners." The order I gave to Mr. Davies, "No prisoners," wasn't born from the anger of a single night. It was forged over years of quiet observation, of understanding the fundamental disconnect between my world and the world of the Morrisons. The truth is, we were from 2 different planets. When I first met Isaac, I was a young lieutenant stationed at Fort Lewis. I lived in a small, bare-bones studio apartment off base. Everything I owned could fit into the back of my pickup truck, packed into a few cardboard boxes and a couple of duffel bags. I was proud of that. Every single item, the cheap particle board bookshelf, the worn-out sofa, the mismatched set of coffee mugs, had been bought and paid for with my own salary. It was a life built on effort, one paycheck at a time. Isaac, on the other hand, lived in a sprawling penthouse apartment in Portland's Pearl District, a graduation gift from his parents. The first time he visited me at my place, he looked around with a kind of bewildered curiosity, like an anthropologist studying a strange new tribe. He watched me cook dinner, a simple meal of chicken and rice, and then watched as I did the dishes. "You don't have a housekeeper?" he asked. The question was utterly genuine, without a hint of malice. He wasn't trying to be condescending, he just couldn't comprehend a world where a person cleaned up after themselves. That was the moment I truly understood. I came from a planet of effort, he came from a planet of inheritance. His life was curated, provided for. My life was earned. This fundamental difference was a gap Vincent could never and would never cross. He called my service playing soldier. He had no concept of what that game actually entailed. He didn't know about the 4 a.m. alarms, the jarring sound that rips you from sleep into the cold, dark reality of another day of training. He didn't know about the 20-mile ruck marches with a 60-pound pack digging into your shoulders, your feet blistering, your lungs burning. He certainly didn't know about West Point in the dead of winter, a bone-deep cold that seeps into you and never quite leaves. And he especially didn't know about Beast Barracks. For 6 weeks, it was hell on earth. It's the program that breaks you down into nothing so they can build you back up into a soldier. I learned to field strip and reassemble my rifle in total darkness until my fingers were raw and bleeding. I learned to scale obstacle walls when every muscle in my body was screaming in protest. It's a place designed to find your breaking point. I found mine on a rainy Tuesday in July. It was a physical fitness test, push-ups, sit-ups, a 2-mile run. I failed the run by 6 seconds. 6 seconds. The punishment was simple. Do it again, immediately. While the rest of my platoon went inside, I had to run the entire 2 miles again, alone, in the pouring rain. My drill sergeant, a man who seemed to be carved from granite and fury, stood under an awning, watching me. As I stumbled across the finish line, drenched and gasping for air, he walked over and barked in my face. "Bird!" he yelled, his voice like gravel. "Pain is just weakness leaving the body. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Sergeant," I screamed back, my voice cracking. That phrase became my mantra. It got me through sleepless nights, through grueling missions, through the quiet loneliness of being a woman in a man's world. It was a reminder that every hardship I endured was making me stronger. I remember my very first paycheck as a second lieutenant. The numbers on it were laughably small by Morrison standards, but to me, it felt like a fortune. It was mine. I had earned every single cent. I used it to buy a new set of tires for my truck and sent a few $100s home to my mom. I never touched a penny from the Kestrel Trust, the inheritance my father left me. Not until I knew, with absolute certainty, that I could stand on my own 2 feet. I had to prove to myself, first and foremost, that my value wasn't tied to a bank account. It was tied to my own effort. The Morrisons, meanwhile, sneered at my government salary. They couldn't grasp that its worth wasn't in the dollar amount, but in the honor and service it represented. Vincent's contempt for me wasn't just personal, it was ideological. It came from the profound ignorance of a man who has never had to struggle. He's never had to build anything from scratch. His empire was built on his father's money, his confidence a thin veneer covering a deep-seated insecurity about his own worth. My worth, on the other hand, I know to the ounce. Because I paid for it. I paid for it with sweat, with tears, and on a few occasions, with blood. My strength doesn't come from a trust fund. It comes from the steel discipline of West Point. It comes from the memory of a drill sergeant screaming at me in the rain. It was forged in fire. And Vincent Morrison was about to feel the heat of that flame. If you've ever had to work twice as hard to get half the recognition, hit that like button. And let me know in the comments what's one phrase or piece of advice that has helped you get through a tough time. I'd love to read them. After I hung up the phone with the order to begin Operation Desert Storm, a profound silence descended inside my car. It was heavier and more suffocating than the silence in the dining room had been. The adrenaline from the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness. I had just declared war on my own family, set in motion a series of events that would shatter lives, including my own. And in that moment, parked alone by the river, I had never felt more utterly and completely alone. My phone buzzed again, lighting up the dark interior of the car. The screen read, "Mr. Davies." I braced myself, expecting a follow-up question, a request for clarification on the operational details. I took a breath to steady my voice, to once again become the cool, detached commander. But the voice on the other end of the line was not that of my financial manager. The professionalism was gone, replaced by a warmth and concern that caught me completely off guard. "Celine," he said, his voice gentle. "I've received the order. But I'm calling you now as James, not as Mr. Davies. Are you okay, kiddo?" Kiddo. That one word, a simple term of endearment he hadn't used since I was a teenager, shattered the ironclad discipline I'd wrapped around myself. It broke through the walls of the soldier, the captain, the commander, and found the wounded woman hiding inside. A choked sob escaped my lips, and for the first time that night, shielded by the privacy of my car and the kindness of a man miles away, I let the tears fall. They weren't loud, desperate sobs, but silent, hot tears that streamed down my face, carrying with them years of pent-up pain, frustration, and loneliness. James Davies wasn't just the man who managed the Kestrel Trust. He was my father's best friend, his closest confidant since their college days. He had known me my entire life. He was a link to the person I missed every single day. My father had been a diplomat, a man of quiet strength who believed that true power was never loud. He moved through the world with a calm, observant grace, and he had tried to instill that same principle in me. "Celine," he used to tell me, his voice a low, comforting rumble, "you don't have to shout to be heard. A quiet action, at the right time and in the right place, has more power than 1,000 speeches." As if reading my mind, James's voice brought my father's memory to life. "Your father would be so proud of you, Celine," he said softly. "Not for the money you have, but for the woman you've become. He would want you to defend your honor. He would expect nothing less." His words were like a warm current flowing through the icy wasteland of my heart, a balm on a bleeding wound. He wasn't just offering sympathy, he was reminding me of who I was, of the legacy I carried. He was reminding me that my values weren't wrong. They were just in the wrong company. "I remember one time," James continued, his voice taking on the familiar cadence of a storyteller. "We were at an embassy posting in South America. There was this arrogant general, a real bully, who was skimming money from aid funds. Your father never raised his voice, never confronted him publicly. Instead, he just did what he did best. He observed. He gathered facts. He used the diplomatic channels, writing quiet, precise reports back to the State Department. 2 months later, the general was silently recalled, his career finished. He never even knew what hit him." James paused, letting the story sink in. "That's how the birds fight, Celine. With intelligence and precision. Not with rage." He wasn't just giving me a pep talk. He was giving me a battle plan. He was reminding me that my last name was more than just a name. It was a strategy. It was a legacy of quiet, unshakable strength. In that moment, he felt more like family to me than the 23 people I had just left behind. He was family built on a foundation of shared memories and mutual respect, not on the hollow pretense of a shared bloodline. Before we ended the call, James said something that I would carry with me into the coming storm. "Vincent Morrison is a small, petty man, Celine. The kind of man who has to tear others down to feel tall. Don't you ever let his smallness define your worth." His voice shifted then, becoming firmer, the way a coach speaks to his player before the big game. "Now, you get some rest, Captain. Tomorrow we show him what a soldier's strength really looks like." When the call ended, I sat in the silence for a long time. But it was a different kind of silence now. The hollowness was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. The tears had stopped. The cold, crystalline resolve had returned, but this time it wasn't brittle with loneliness. It was fortified with the strength of an alliance. I was no longer fighting alone. I was fighting for my honor, for my family's legacy, and with the unwavering support of a true and loyal friend. The storm was coming for the House of Morrison, and I was ready to command it. I woke up the next morning before my alarm, the quiet determination from the night before still humming in my veins. The first assault didn't come from a market downturn or a lawyer's letter. It came, as it always did, through my phone. It started with a single text from Isaac, then another, and another, until my phone was buzzing nonstop on the nightstand. It was a digital deluge of panicked pleas. "Celine, please, we need to talk. Dad was wrong. I know he was. Call me. Please don't do anything reckless." Reckless? I stared at the word on my screen. The reckless thing was allowing myself to endure years of quiet humiliation. The reckless thing was believing that my service and my accomplishments might one day earn me a seat at their table. Standing up for myself wasn't reckless. It was long overdue. Then came the texts from Patricia, my mother-in-law. Hers were crafted with the subtle artistry of a lifelong manipulator. She adopted the tone of a victim, the heartbroken matriarch watching her family crumble. "Celine, you're tearing this family apart. Vincent is just a blunt man. You know how he is." And the final, masterfully guilt-inducing message: "How can you let one little comment destroy everything we have?" I read each message, my anger simmering into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. There were no apologies, not one. There was no acknowledgement of the pain they had caused. There was only blame. In their narrative, I wasn't the one who had been publicly humiliated. I was the one causing the problem. My reaction was the issue, not their action. I ignored them all. At 9 a.m. sharp, I was at my desk in my home office, connected via a secure video call with James. We were going over the final sequence of events, the precise timing of the capital withdrawal notifications. My laptop screen was filled with spreadsheets and legal documents. It was my new battlefield, and I felt more at home here than I had at that dinner table. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Through the security camera feed, I saw him. Isaac. He looked terrible. His usually perfect hair was a mess, and his expensive suit was wrinkled. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. I buzzed him in. He practically stumbled into my office, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "Celine, Dad's losing his mind," he said, his voice ragged. "He doesn't believe you can do anything. He thinks it's all a bluff. I came here to beg you. Please, just reconsider. We can talk this out." I leaned back in my chair and looked at my husband, the man who had sat silently while his father ripped my honor to shreds. "Isaac," I said, my voice calm and even. "Last night, when he called me trash, where were you?" He flinched. "When he insulted the uniform I wear, the same uniform your grandfather once wore with pride, what did you do?" He looked down at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. "I froze," he mumbled. "I'm sorry." The apology sounded genuine, but it was a hollow word. It was the apology of a weak man, offered too late, with no conviction behind it. It was the same apology I'd heard a dozen times before, and I knew it would not be the last. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang again. It was Patricia. Of course it was. She arrived carrying a wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth, a caricature of maternal concern. She swept into the room, a whirlwind of expensive perfume and false sincerity. "Celine, darling," she cooed, placing the basket on my desk. I could smell the warm, sweet scent of fresh baking. Blueberry muffins, as if a cheap pastry could somehow patch the gaping wound she had helped create. "We're family, and families forgive each other. Vincent is terribly sorry for what he said." Her performance was flawless, but her eyes gave her away. They kept darting from my face to the leather-bound portfolio on my desk, the one containing the Kestrel Trust's operational plans. Her eyes were hungry and filled with fear. She wasn't here for me. She was here for the money. She was here to protect her lavish lifestyle, her country club membership, her next trip to Europe. This pathetic performance of family unity was the most insulting lie of all. I took a deep breath, marshaling my discipline. "Please," I said, gesturing to the two chairs in front of my desk. Sit down. They both sat, looking like two children called into the principal's office. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before I spoke, my voice devoid of the warmth they were used to. It was the voice of Captain Bird. I understand that you are both concerned, I began, my tone cool and professional, as if addressing junior officers. But you need to understand that this is no longer a family matter. This is a business decision. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto theirs. Morrison Development was in breach of a fundamental ethics clause with its primary investor. The investor was subjected to a hostile and unprofessional environment by the company's CEO. I let that sink in. Isaac and Patricia stared at me, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. They were looking at me as if they had never seen me before, and maybe they hadn't. And that investor, I concluded, my voice dropping to a near whisper but carrying the weight of an execution order, which is me, has decided to withdraw her confidence. The Celine they knew, the quiet, accommodating, endlessly patient woman who endured their slights and insults, had died in that dining room last night. The person sitting before them now was Captain Bird of the United States Army, and she was on a mission. Isaac was in the middle of a rambling, desperate appeal about family legacy and the importance of forgiveness. Beside him, Patricia nodded emphatically, her expression a carefully constructed mask of maternal sorrow. It was a pathetic, two-pronged assault of guilt and fear, and it was failing spectacularly. My eyes flickered to the digital clock on my wall. It was 9:55 a.m., as if on cue, my phone rang. Its vibration a sharp buzz against the polished wood of my desk. The screen lit up with a name I had been expecting. Vincent. A slow, cold smile touched my lips. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the catalyst he was about to provide. "Excuse me," I said, holding up a single finger to cut off Isaac's stammering plea. He fell silent. I answered the call and, with a deliberate movement, pressed the speakerphone button, placing the phone in the center of the desk. The room was instantly filled with the sound of pure, undiluted rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Vincent's voice roared from the small speaker, so loud it felt like he was physically in the room. Isaac and Patricia flinched, shrinking back in their chairs. It was a conditioned response, honed over years of living under his tyrannical rule. "Who do you think you are, threatening me?" Vincent bellowed on. "You're a grunt soldier, a nobody. What could you possibly know about real business? I'm giving you 5 minutes, 5 minutes to call off whatever stupid little game you're playing. You call your people, you tell them it was a mistake, and you apologize. You do that, or so help me God, you'll regret the day you ever met my son." His arrogance was a force of nature. Even now, teetering on the edge of an abyss he couldn't see, his instinct wasn't to question, but to dominate. He was issuing a command, fully expecting me to crumble, as his wife and son always did. He was so blinded by his own power, he couldn't recognize he was holding a losing hand. And that was it. That was the final straw. Any microscopic, lingering thread of doubt, any vestigial sense of obligation to the family name I carried, vaporized in the heat of his rage. This wasn't a man who had made a terrible mistake. This was a bully, furious that his victim was finally fighting back. He was irredeemable. I glanced across the desk at Isaac and Patricia. I saw the familiar, naked terror in their eyes, the same paralyzed fear that had kept them silent and complicit. They were still his prisoners, trapped in a gilded cage. But I was not. My training had prepared me for moments like this. When faced with an irrational force, you do not engage. You neutralize. I leaned toward the phone. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. My voice, when I spoke, was not loud, but it cut through his roaring with the clean, cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "You have 4 minutes, Vincent." And then I hit end call. The abrupt silence that followed was more shocking than his yelling had been. Isaac and Patricia stared at me, their mouths open, their faces etched with terror and disbelief. I gave them no attention. I turned my full focus to my laptop screen, where James's calm, serious face was waiting. Our eyes met through the camera. He hadn't heard the call, but he saw the look on my face. He knew. The time for deliberation was over. James, I said, my voice crisp, clear, and stripped of all emotion. Execute. James gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture of unwavering trust. Understood, Captain, he replied, his expression grim but resolute. 3 communiques will be dispatched simultaneously at 10 SAR for race hours. What communiques? Isaac finally managed to stammer, his voice a reedy whisper. Celine, what are you doing? I didn't answer him. My eyes were fixed on the large digital clock on my wall. 9:56. The second hand swept around the face in a smooth, relentless arc. The world outside seemed to fade away. The only thing that mattered was the countdown, the final ticking seconds of the Morrison Empire as they knew it. 9:57. Patricia was rocking slightly in her chair, wringing her hands, her knuckles white. 9:58. Isaac was staring at me now, the fear in his eyes being replaced by a dawning, horrified comprehension. He was finally connecting the dots, finally starting to understand the scale of the power he had never known I possessed. 9:59. I could feel my own heart beating against my ribs, a steady, rhythmic drum. This wasn't a hot-blooded act of revenge. This was a cold, calculated tactical strike. This was justice. 10 dears. A soft, almost imperceptible ping sounded from my laptop's speakers, a single digital chime that signaled the end of an era. It was done. 3 digital missiles, launched from servers on opposite sides of the country, had just hit their targets. The first was a formal, legally binding email, sent from the Kestrel Trust's legal team on Wall Street to Vincent's corporate attorneys. The subject line was brutally efficient. Immediate and full withdrawal of all capital investment from Morrison Development. The second was a detailed, personal email sent from my account to Isaac's. It contained a full history of the Kestrel Trust, my role as its sole director, and my reason for investing, specifically citing the provision for veterans' housing. The entire truth, in cold, hard, undeniable black and white. And the third, the simplest and most devastating of all, was a text message. Sent from my phone directly to Vincent's. It contained just 7 carefully chosen words. I picked up my phone from the desk. Isaac and Patricia watched my every move as if I were a queen cobra about to strike. I turned the screen toward them, holding it steady in the silent room. On it, the text I had just sent to Vincent was displayed in a stark, green bubble, the delivery confirmation right below it. It read, "You should never underestimate a soldier." Patricia let out a strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. Isaac just slumped in his chair as if his strings had been cut, all the color draining from his face, leaving it a sickly, pasty white. He understood now. He finally, truly understood the magnitude of what had just happened. The room fell silent once again. But this wasn't the suffocating, shameful silence of the night before. This was the cold, profound, and final silence of an execution chamber after the sentence has been carried out. And I was the one who had pulled the switch. If you're on my side, hit that like button. And for the comment, I want you to finish this sentence for me. The best revenge is rose. Let's see what you've got. The silence in the room after the ping lasted less than 60 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. It was a vacuum, a void of disbelief where Isaac and Patricia were suspended, unable to process what had just happened. Then chaos erupted. Isaac's phone buzzed violently on the floor where he'd dropped it minutes earlier, but he didn't move. A second phone, his work cell, began ringing from his jacket pocket, a frantic, tinny melody. Simultaneously, a notification chimed on his smartwatch. It was the email I had sent him. He fumbled for his phone on the floor, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip it. He answered the call. "What?" he snapped, his voice tight with panic. It was his assistant. I could hear the frantic squawking on the other end. As he listened, his eyes scanned the email on his watch. I watched the information register on his face. I saw his pupils dilate in horror, his jaw go slack. He was a man watching his entire reality crumble in real time. Cancel everything, he stammered into the phone. Just cancel it." He didn't even end the call. The phone just slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor for a second time. He slowly raised his head to look at me. The man I was looking at was not my husband. He was a stranger, his face a horrifying cocktail of fear, disbelief, and a strange, terrifying kind of awe. It was the look a primitive man might give to a lightning strike. "Kestrel," he whispered, his voice shattered. "The Kestrel Trust. It's you?" He shook his head, a jerky, desperate motion. No, it can't be. Dad said, he said it was an investment fund from New York. He said he met with them. I remained perfectly still in my chair, my hands resting calmly on the desk. "He never met with them, Isaac," I said, my voice measured and clear. "He met with their lawyers, and those lawyers work for James Davies. And James Davies works for me." I let each piece of information land like a carefully placed stone, sending ripples across the wreckage of his understanding. For the last 18 months, 80% of Morrison Development's liquid capital has come from the Kestrel Trust. From my trust. I paused, letting the sheer scale of it sink in. And Isaac, the only reason I invested, the sole reason that provision was made, was because of the veterans' housing component in the Crown Plaza project. The military career your father despises, the service he calls playing soldier, is the only thing that has kept his empire from collapsing for the last year and a half. The final piece clicked into place. I saw it in his eyes, the dawning horror. Isaac sank back into his chair and buried his face in his hands, a low, guttural moan escaping his lips. "Oh my God," he breathed into his palms. All this time, he was praising them. He was toasting the anonymous investor. He was talking about you. The whole time, he was talking about you. Just then my own phone began to ring, the name Vincent flashing on the screen. His rage had found its target. I looked at the screen, then calmly pressed the red decline button. The ringing stopped. A second later, a text message notification appeared. The message was in all caps, a testament to his helpless fury. "You bitch! What did you do?" I picked up my phone and held it out for Isaac to see. He raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, and read the message. He then looked from the phone back to me, and for the first time, I saw not just fear, but a profound, soul-deep shame wash over his face. "I'm so sorry, Celine," he whispered, his voice choked with regret. I had no idea." Patricia, who had been frozen in a state of catatonic shock, finally broke. A loud, wrenching sob tore from her throat. It wasn't a cry of sympathy for me. It was the sound of pure, selfish despair. "Oh dear God, Vincent," she wailed, her words muffled by her hands. "What has he done? What has he done to us?" They finally understood. This wasn't a family argument that could be smoothed over with blueberry muffins and empty apologies. This was a war. And it was a war they had already lost before they even knew they were fighting. I looked at Isaac, at the broken man who was my husband. My voice was no longer that of a wife. It was the calm, analytical voice of an officer delivering an after-action report. "Your father went to business school, Isaac. I went to West Point. There, they teach a military doctrine called shock and awe. The principle is simple. You overwhelm your adversary with a display of superior force so sudden and so devastating that it paralyzes their will to fight." I stood up, my chair making a soft scraping sound on the floor. I was in command. "The war ended at 10:01 this morning when you read that email. All of this," I said, gesturing to the weeping woman and the broken man before me. "This is just clearing the battlefield." I was no longer their daughter-in-law. I was no longer Isaac's quiet, compliant wife. I was a force they had foolishly provoked. And now, they would all have to face the consequences. I didn't have to wait long. Exactly 15 minutes after I had declared the end of the war, the sound of squealing tires echoed from the street outside. A black Bentley sedan swerved violently into my driveway, braking so hard the car lurched forward on its suspension. The driver's side door flew open before the engine was even off, and Vincent Morrison stormed out, his face a mask of purple rage. He didn't even bother to close the car door behind him. This wasn't an arrival. It was a desperate invasion. He pounded on my front door, the heavy thuds vibrating through the house. Isaac, who had been sitting in a catatonic state, jumped up and rushed to the door. "Dad, wait, don't," he began, but it was useless. Vincent shoved his own son aside with a guttural roar, sending Isaac stumbling back into the foyer. He stormed into my home, his eyes wild and bloodshot, searching for me. When he saw me standing calmly in the doorway of my office, he pointed a trembling finger. "You!" he screamed, his voice hoarse with a mixture of fury and panic. "What did you do?" He took a few steps closer, his chest heaving. "This is some kind of fraud, a trick. You can't be the Kestrel Trust. You're just a goddamn grunt soldier." His denial was so absolute, so profound, it was almost pathological. He was a man drowning, and the truth was the water filling his lungs. He simply could not process a reality where I held any power over him. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The battlefield had been prepared. I simply met his crazed glare with a look of utter calm and gestured with my head toward the large monitor on my office wall. "In here, Vincent." He hesitated for a second, then barged past me into the office. Isaac and Patricia hovered nervously in the doorway behind him, watching the final act of their family tragedy unfold. On the 65-inch screen, I already had the secure login portal for the Kestrel Trust open. I entered my credentials. The first page that loaded was the asset overview. The numbers were staggering. A real-time tracker showed the total value of the trust, a 9-figure sum that danced and flickered with the market's every move. I watched Vincent's face in the reflection on the screen. The apoplectic rage began to recede, replaced by a flicker of confusion and a dawning, sickening dread. The numbers were irrefutable. Without a word, I clicked to the next tab, Transaction History. I had filtered it to show only one recipient, Morrison Development. Line by line, the screen filled with a meticulous record of every capital injection, every wire transfer that had kept his company afloat for the last 18 months. The dates, the routing numbers, the exact dollar amounts. It was all there, a cold, digital ledger of his salvation at my hands. His breathing became shallow. The color was draining from his face. For the final blow, I opened the Trust's founding charter, a scanned legal document bearing the seal of a prestigious New York law firm. I used the mouse to zoom in on a specific section, enlarging the text until it filled the entire screen. The heading was clear, Beneficiary and Sole Fiduciary Authority. And beneath it, my name, printed in crisp, undeniable black letters, Captain Celine A. Byrd, U.S. Army. That was the moment he broke. The last ounce of fight left him. His face went ashen, a deathly white. He took an involuntary step backward, stumbling into a bookshelf behind him. Books rattled on the shelves. "No," he whispered, the word a faint puff of air. It's not possible." I rose slowly from my chair and crossed my arms, standing before him, not as his daughter-in-law, but as his victor. "In the military, Vincent, we learn the importance of reconnaissance," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "You have to know the terrain, and you have to know your enemy. You failed on both counts." I took a step closer, my eyes boring into his. "You were in a vulnerable position, and you launched an unprovoked attack against an ally who was actively protecting your flank. In my world, that's a rookie mistake. It's the kind of tactical error that gets soldiers killed." I let the words hang in the air, a final, damning assessment. "For you, it's just going to cost you everything." As if on cue, as if orchestrated by some cosmic director, his phone began to ring. A shrill, panicked sound in the silent room. He fumbled for it in his pocket, his hand shaking uncontrollably. He looked at the caller ID. It was his primary lender at the bank. He stared at the screen, paralyzed, and let it go to voicemail. It immediately began ringing again. A different number. I recognized the name of his business partner's lead attorney. He silenced it. A third call came through, this time from the City of Portland Planning Commissioner. The financial storm had hit. The network of power and influence he had spent a lifetime building was collapsing in on him in real time, one phone call at a time. He looked at the phone, then his eyes darted up to meet mine. The rage was gone. The denial was gone. All that was left was the raw, naked desperation of a defeated king. "Celine," he started, his voice a pathetic, pleading rasp. We're family." I looked at him, at this small, broken man standing amidst the ruins of his own arrogance. My expression was as cold and hard as a block of ice. "You burned that bridge yourself last night, Vincent." After Vincent stumbled out of my house, leaving Isaac and Patricia weeping in the ruins of their world, there was no triumphant celebration. There was only a profound and heavy silence. Victory, it turns out, is a quiet affair. The days that followed were a blur of headlines and phone calls. The collapse of Morrison Development wasn't just a story. It was a sensation that spread like wildfire through Oregon's business journals and local news outlets. As James had predicted, the sudden withdrawal of the Kestrel Trust's capital triggered a series of cross-default clauses in Vincent's other loans. It was a perfect domino effect. The banks, sensing weakness, called in their debts all at once. Within a week, it was all gone. The company was forced into liquidation. The sprawling mansion in the West Hills was put up for sale. The black Bentley was repossessed. Vincent Morrison, the titan of Portland real estate, filed for personal bankruptcy. But the financial ruin was only part of his downfall. The juicier story, the one that was whispered at cocktail parties and in country club locker rooms, was the why. The narrative of a powerful CEO being brought down because he publicly humiliated his own daughter-in-law, a decorated army captain who also happened to be his secret benefactor, was simply too deliciously ironic to ignore. He didn't just lose his fortune, he lost his reputation. He became a cautionary tale, a social pariah, a joke. And for a man like Vincent, that was a fate worse than poverty. A few days later, Isaac asked to meet. We chose a small, neutral coffee shop in the Alphabet District, a place with no memories attached. He looked thinner, the confident swagger he once had completely gone, replaced by a quiet, somber humility. He stirred his black coffee, his eyes focused on the swirling liquid. "I filed for legal separation from my parents," he said, his voice low. He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were clear, filled with a sad resolve. "I can't be a part of that toxicity anymore, Celine. I should have stood up for you. I should have stood up for myself, years ago." He pushed a small velvet box across the table toward me. It was the same box I remembered from my graduation dinner. My breath caught in my throat. I opened it. Inside, resting on the faded satin, was his grandfather's West Point ring. "This belongs to you," he said softly. "It always has." I stared at the ring, the heavy gold a symbol of so much pain and injustice. But now it felt different. It felt like a reclamation. I didn't put it on. Instead, I simply closed the box. "Thank you, Isaac," I whispered. It was a bittersweet and necessary moment. A part of me still loved the man sitting across from me, but there was too much broken glass between us, too many years of him choosing silence over me. We agreed to a trial separation, a chance for both of us to heal on our own, away from the wreckage of his family. As we said goodbye on the rain-slicked sidewalk, I didn't know if we would ever find our way back to each other. But for the first time, I felt at peace with that uncertainty. A week later, a handwritten letter arrived in the mail. The envelope was made of thick, expensive cream-colored paper, and the return address was a new, much smaller apartment. It was from Patricia. I almost threw it away, but my curiosity got the better of me. I sat and read it. It was not the letter I expected. There were no excuses, no attempts to defend Vincent. It was a simple, stark apology. She apologized not just for the events of that night, but for her years of silence, for her complicity, for her weakness. "You deserved so much better," she wrote in her elegant, looping cursive. "I hope one day you can find it in your heart to forgive my cowardice." I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. I felt a flicker of something, pity perhaps, but not forgiveness. Forgiveness is a long journey, and it was one I needed to start alone, for myself. I never replied. Before my leave was up and I had to return to my unit, there was one last piece of business to attend to. It was a final move on the chessboard, a psychological checkmate. Through James, the Kestrel Trust announced a major new partnership. We were teaming up with a different Portland-based construction company, a rising firm founded and run by a former Marine Corps combat engineer. And our first joint project was announced with a press release and a large sign erected on a newly acquired plot of land. The project, a state-of-the-art residential and support center for homeless and at-risk veterans, a place for healing, for training, for rebuilding lives. The location, a prime piece of real estate directly across the street from the now empty, sealed-up former headquarters of Morrison Development. Every day, for the rest of his life, whenever Vincent Morrison dared to drive past the tombstone of his fallen empire, he would be forced to look at the legacy being built in its place. He would see a monument to the very values he had scorned, a testament to the community he had called worthless. It was my final message to him and to the world. The legacy of service will always outlast the legacy of greed. A year later, I returned to Portland on leave. The city was just as I remembered it. The persistent gray sky, the scent of damp earth and coffee, the familiar silhouette of Mount Hood on the horizon. The city hadn't changed, but I had. The first thing I did was visit the construction site across from the empty shell of the Morrison Development building. What was once a vacant lot was now a bustling hub of activity. Concrete foundations were poured, steel frames reached for the sky, and the sounds of saws and hammers filled the air. It was the sound of something new being born from the ashes of something old. I stood there for a long time, watching the walls go up, feeling a profound sense of pride that was deeper and more satisfying than any victory I'd ever felt in my war with Vincent. This was the real victory. This was the real legacy. The site foreman, a burly man with a Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm, came over to greet me. He was the owner of the company I'd partnered with. He wiped his dusty hand on his jeans before shaking mine, his grip firm and respectful. "Captain Bird," he said with a wide grin. "Good to see you. She's coming along, isn't she?" "She is," I said, unable to stop smiling. "It's incredible." He looked from the rising structure back to me, his expression turning serious. "You know, Captain," he said, his voice lowering with sincerity. "What you're doing here, it's more than just building apartments. You're rebuilding lives. You're giving guys who were left behind a second chance. Don't ever forget that." His words hit me with the force of a physical blow, but in the best possible way. He was right. The anger that had fueled me for so long was gone, replaced by something warmer, something more constructive. I no longer carried the heavy burden of resentment. I'd found a better use for my strength. Later that week, I met with Isaac. Our separation had been good for him. He had moved to Seattle, taking a position at a smaller, independent firm where he could make a name for himself, free from the long, toxic shadow of his father. He was building his own life, on his own terms. We had started talking again, first with tentative texts, then with long phone calls that lasted late into the night. We were, slowly and cautiously, starting over. The love between us, I realized, had never truly died. It had just been buried under years of fear, silence, and misplaced loyalty. Now it was being rebuilt, piece by piece, on a new foundation of honesty, equality, and mutual respect. Maybe one day we'll find our way completely back to each other. Maybe we won't. But for the first time in our relationship, the future felt like a blank page, not a history book we were doomed to repeat. And that was a beautiful thing. I now wear the West Point ring. Not on my finger, but on a simple silver chain around my neck. It rests close to my heart, a constant, heavy presence. It's no longer a symbol of injustice, of something that was stolen from me. It has become a reminder of the strength it takes to fight for what you believe in. A reminder that honor is not something you inherit like a piece of jewelry. It's something that is forged in the fires of adversity every single day. On my last day in Portland, I drove up to Pittock Mansion, the historic house perched high in the West Hills. From the gardens there, you can see the entire city spread out below you. The bridges, the rivers, the downtown skyline. I stood there, looking out at the panoramic view. And I thought about the long, painful journey that had brought me to this moment of peace. I didn't bring down Vincent Morrison's empire out of hatred. I did it out of a deep, unshakable sense of honor. He had tried to strip me of mine, to define me by his own small materialistic standards. And in doing so, he taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. Never, ever let another person define your worth. You define it yourself, through your actions, your principles, and your service to others. My true legacy won't be the size of the Kestrel Trust. It won't be etched onto a tombstone or the facade of a building. It will be written in the lives of the soldiers I helped, in the integrity I fought to protect, and in the quiet, unshakable peace I have finally found for myself. Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought on foreign soil with guns and bombs. They're fought at the family dinner table, with words and silence. And sometimes to truly win, to build something better and stronger, you have to be willing to burn it all down and start again from the ground up. And so, my battle found its peace. Thank you for being here, for listening to my journey. I know that for so many of you, your own battles might look different, but they are just as real. This channel is a place for stories like these. Stories of finding strength when you feel powerless and rebuilding when things fall apart. If my journey resonated with you, please show your support by hitting the like button. Subscribe to become part of our community so you never miss a story of resilience. And in the comments below, I'd be honored if you shared just one word that describes your strength. Your story matters.